whenever I prepare something like this, it shocks me again, the scale of the challenge that we face. So, as many of you will know, according to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the last 3 decades have been the warmest since 1850. During that time, we've seen the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases reaching levels that we certainly haven't seen for at least 800,000 years. And it's very much the scientific consensus that most of that increase is a result of human activity, anthropogenic gases, and that these things are closely related. Behind those kind of big global pictures, you know, millennial processes and global averages, there's of course complex detail of the effects of climate change, and already millions of lives are affected, often in very acute ways, by extreme weather events, by disruption to food systems, and so on. Of course, we can never say that any one such event is the result of any particular climate process. It's very complex, and there have always been bad events. But the increasing intensity of such events and frequency of such events is consistent with what we would expect from scientific understandings of climate change. So it's against that background that the Conference of the Parties will be meeting in Paris in a few weeks. The 21st time that this conference has assembled itself, this time seeking to reach binding international legal agreements with the ambition of having those agreements underpinning restrictions on the emission of greenhouse gases that will enable us to have a pretty good chance of avoiding an average global temperature increase of more than 2 degrees. So that 2 degrees is seen as this fundamental target. 2 degrees isn't taken to be a target where, you know, if we avoid this increase to 2 degrees, it's not that this won't have serious effects. We're already seeing serious effects with a much smaller average global increase. But it's presented as an acceptable level of effects from climate change, given the difficulty of avoiding anything less. So it's seen as acceptable because the effects are hopefully not going to be too extensive. The effects will be quite locally felt, rather than being systematic changes to ways of life more generally. But is 2 degrees the right target? And there's a lot of dissent about this. As with most things around climate change, when you try and put a number or something certain on it, there's going to be dissent. But the history of how 2 degrees C became established as an agreed target is quite interesting. I haven't got time to go into it. But it's just become kind of an accepted target to go for. And there are certainly scientists who say that a 2 degrees C increase will not be acceptable. And there's obviously different grounds for saying it won't be acceptable. First, there's disagreement about just what the physical effect will be from an average 2 degrees C increase. And secondly, there's of course political differences about what would count as acceptable. It of course depends who you ask. Whether you ask people like us at a relatively high altitude in a relatively wealthy country with relatively temperate environment, or whether you ask somebody on a Pacific island, what counts as acceptable is obviously going to be quite different. But there's some scientists who say a 2 degree average increase will already have drastic consequences at a global level. That 2 degrees C is too high an increase to have. Given that, it's a bit worrying that some scientists, some of the same scientists, say it's already too late. We're going to have to essentially perform miracles to avoid a 2 degrees C increase. That the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is already on track for getting us towards a 2 degrees C increase or more. Finally, in terms of the contestations I'm covering here, more accepted is not so much the kind of radical voices in science saying this, but there's questions of whether the commitments in the run-up to Paris are going to get us very close to staying within 2 degrees C. So the nations attending the conference, most of them have already submitted their action plans to Paris, and they are unprecedented in their ambition, absolutely. But even the United Nations last week said it's not enough. These unprecedented level of international commitments will not be sufficient to stop us going beyond an increase of 2 degrees C or more globally. But in the end, it's not too surprising that it's difficult to envisage how the international community can get there. It is really challenging. If you see it in the big numbers again, according to the IPCC, I won't try and say it again because I get my tongue twisted as I've demonstrated. The IPCC estimates that starting from a 2011 baseline, we can, as a global community, we can emit something like 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide to have a 66% chance of staying beneath the 2 degrees C increase by the end of the century. That's kind of hard to imagine what 1,000 gigatons would be, but since 2011, we've emitted 150 gigatons, 15% of our global budget through to 2011. So managing to stay within that budget would mean fairly radical things like leaving about 80% of known fossil fuel reserves in the ground. Reserves that companies have already spent money on getting the rights to, beginning to exploit. It just has to stay in the ground. And of course, the longer we wait to peak, the longer we wait to ensure that our consumption of fossil fuels hits a peak and starts to decline, the more radical that decline then has to be if we're to stay within that budget. And in the end, the challenge of this represents how far our societies, the complexity of our societies that we take as normal, are so very much dependent upon fossil fuel. Essentially, modern society, the scale of global population, can be attributed largely to our exploitation of fossil fuels, beginning to be able to exploit that. Those millions and millions of years of solar energy that was fossilized in the ground. Releasing that energy has fueled the way in which we've developed as societies and grown as a population. So in the end, tackling these issues means really radical changes. Changes to infrastructures, embedded infrastructures, sunk investments, changes to industries, challenges to embedded interests, not least some of the major corporations involved in oil or cars. Thinking about some of the sort of fundamental ideologies that underpin the way in which our societies are organized, the ways in which economic growth is understood as a defining feature, a particular understanding of economic well-being. And in the end, it means changes to ways of life, the way in which we live, the way in which we work, the way in which we play. All of these things are likely to have to be reconfigured. We can, of course, hope for technological changes, and we will have technological changes undoubtedly. But in the end, there's going to be changes to the very ways in which we live our lives. So it's little wonder that policymakers, themselves part of the global elite like us, who have relative wealth, who have the greatest responsibility for the emissions of climate change gases. It's not surprising that policymakers have difficulty confronting the scale of the challenge. They have my sympathies. But in the end, it's not just going to be down to those politicians. And the 2 degrees C target, while it can be contested, while you can say it's just a kind of a point of convenient compromise between scientific knowledge, political expediency, public acceptability, it's nevertheless clearly a rallying point, something which can engender action. And it is engendering action. In Paris in a few weeks, that it is very likely that we will have an unprecedented scale of international commitment. Action which is going to take us at least in the right direction, even if not far enough. So clearly, politicians are very important. At that level of the global agreement that's needed, it's down to those leaders. But it's not just going to be politicians, of course. It's got to be actors throughout society, individuals, businesses, industries, and universities. And arguably, universities have a heavier weight of responsibility than many, given our status as institutions of learning and critical reflection. So it's really great to be here, not only to be part of a great lineup of speakers, which is really flattering, but also to be able to support the energy and commitment of the people behind the carbon neutral University of Sheffield. So thanks very much.